Okay, again, thank you all for making the time to be with us tonight. I am so happy to be able to introduce the senior capstone presentations. This is an honors program tradition. This is what we affectionately call December SASH, not to be confused with April SASH, Student Academic Showcase. It's an opportunity for our senior graduates. We have 3 of them tonight with some fantastic presentations. It's an opportunity for them to show off their capstones, which are really the culminating achievements in their particular areas of academic achievement and research. Without really any further ado, actually, I want to introduce Dr. Laura Turner. Oh, actually, before I do that, sorry, Laura, I want to give a special thanks to, in addition to our 3 senior presenters tonight, I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Bill Palm, who has been working to develop the capstone in his previous role as the Associate Director of the Honors Program, a role that Dr. Turner is now ably and capably taking into the future and making even more fantastic. But thank you, Dr. Palm. I am absolutely certain that if the presentation tonight are great, it's because of because of your work. If they're terrible, which I know they won't be, Olivia, Lick, or Zach, it's my fault. So with that said, please, Dr. Turner, if you could take the mic and take the stage.
All right, thank you, Dr. Campbell, and welcome everyone. We thought this would be a wonderful way to celebrate the almost end of a challenging semester. So what better way than to hear from some of our graduates in the honors program. So for those of you who are less familiar with our capstone presentations, again, typically this is done at our spring sash, but we have 3 graduates or very near graduates with us tonight who are finishing a semester early. So we want to give them the opportunity to share their work with us and to give them the kind of wonderful end to their honors experience here, for our December grads. So for the capstone, again, this is a project that culminates what is normally 4 years of work, but again, our graduates tonight are finishing in 3.5 years, so all the more impressive. The capstone is a student-driven project that students choose. It typically corresponds with a major or minor program of study. And it goes a little bit beyond that. It's more than, say, a senior thesis. It's more than a capstone experience in a major, because as we'll be hearing from our graduates tonight, they're also going to tie it in with the 4 years of honors education, rather. So looking back as senior graduates, they'll look back to their earliest experiences at honors and how that helped influence the project they chose here in their senior year. And tonight we have 3 presentations, and I'll introduce you to each of them. I think it's a wonderful sampling of the diverse array of areas that our honor students choose to study. We have one from criminal justice, another from public health, and another one from international relations. So I'm really excited to hear more about these projects and what the students have been working on so carefully, so diligently this semester. So without further ado, we're mostly here to hear from the students. Let me introduce Olivia Franco. Okay. Biology major, public health and mathematics minor, and she's going to be talking to us about a policy analysis, an increase in Bristol, Rhode Island mask wearing. So Olivia, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me get this all presented. Everyone see that? Perfect. All right, hi, my name is Olivia Franco. I am a biology major, public health and mathematics minor, and I did my honors capstone on a policy analysis on increased mask compliance in Bristol, Rhode Island. So the question I looked at was, how can the Bristol Health Equity Zone increase mask compliance in Bristol? This project began as an addition to a semester-long policy analysis in my health policy class. In that analysis, my group looked at mandated flu vaccines for the state of Rhode Island for K-12 public schools. BHES and Dr. Cottle, my advisor, helped me organize this capstone project, which I wrote a grant for BHES. They received some money from the CARES Funding Act, so I looked at ways that they could increase mask compliance through that money. Due to a shortened timeline, they went along with their own course of action and already allocated money to a program that they're going to do. But they're going to use this policy analysis for future plans, as well as the beginning of a collaboration with public health Roger Williams students. So I'm just going to quickly go over where I gathered most of my information from. The first one being news articles. I mostly use New England news articles for reasons for people not wanting to wear a mask, as well as the COVID-19 levels throughout the past couple of months. I then looked at town documents, mostly Bristol's town composition, to look at factors including income, education level, and ethnicity. I then looked at government documents because they did receive federal funding, so I looked at how that money had to be spent and what type of regulations had to be looked at for this. And finally, I used a lot of BHES's website resources, information on them, their mission, and their values. So when writing a policy analysis, the values of your client are really important. It's what all of your options are going to be framed around. These are the values and criteria that I focused on for this policy analysis. The first one being town health and safety. The second being the mission and vision of BHES, which is centered around equal access and opportunity to health and education. Third one being community reach, and the last one being cost effectiveness. So I came up with 3 options for them, as well as a recommendation. The first one being to distribute masks at popular Bristol locations like Thames Street and the Bristol Stop and Shop. Some benefits of this option were that we would be able to reach a high quantity of people, as these are frequently located areas for Bristol residents, as well as people are a lot more likely to put a mask on when it's directly handed to them. Some constraints were that we couldn't maybe reach all these marginalized populations that wouldn't be frequenting these locations, so that was the main constraint here. For our second option, we looked at launching an educational campaign that promotes mask wearing benefits online. So it would be posted to BHES's website, as well as the town's Facebook page, which has around 10,000 followers on it. In this educational campaign, we'd just show the benefits of wearing a mask, how to properly wear it, and how that helps your community. The problem here was that only around 85% of Bristol residents currently have internet access. And even if they did have internet access, it wouldn't necessarily require them to see this educational campaign. And finally, the last issue that, with this option was, if people aren't listening to the CDC, why would they choose to listen to BHES or any educational campaign done by them? Our third option was a mass mailing of masks to Bristol residents, as well as including an educational component to it. This was a great option to, which will be my recommendation, because we are able to reach everyone in the community, even those marginalized populations. It also gives everyone an equal access to this health option. And if everyone is given a mask, hopefully a reusable one, then it would lower mask compliance, as people would be more likely to wear it. And this is just a little bit of a framework of what that would look like. Reusable masks would be mailed out to every household, including the number of masks for the number of people in the household. The envelope would include an educational pamphlet, similar to the information that would be in the educational campaign about how to correctly wear a mask and the benefits of it, as well as a problem that I came across with this is it is a little bit pricier to do this for postage, masks, and for the educational component. But with Roger Williams student participation and public health students being able to volunteer with BHES to collaborate with them, we'd be able to lower the cost of staffing, as well as the educational component, if Roger Williams students created that. And now it's not letting me change the slide. Okay, so another relevance of the project, this screenshot over here on the right are today's cases. I took it this morning and put it into the presentation. We're rounding around 1,000 new cases every single day, as well as around 10 to 20 deaths. So as we're entering the second wave, mask compliance is extremely, extremely important. As Bristol residents, we care about our town's safety and health, and with COVID cases at an all-time high, safety precautions are more important now than ever. This policy analysis is also really important because it informs current and future public health situations. There's been a lot of past campaigns for a compliance of the general public, so this could add to information about that. So now with this information, what do I do as an honor student? I first wanted to go over a couple of limitations of this project. The first one being time, as I only had this first semester to gather information and put all of this together into the project, as well as BHAS had their own timeline, so they had a course of action that they took also. Another limitation was the information. Information about COVID changed from the beginning of the school year to now, so I had to keep very up to date with that, as well as we only had the information that pertained to mask wearing from news articles. If times were different, I would be able to go and interview Bristol residents and see what their reason was for wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. But since for health concerns, I wasn't able to do that. And lastly, the demographic. We only looked at instances in Bristol and how this policy analysis would do in Bristol. We would have been able to do our own interviews, and then we could compare what Bristol residents were saying versus, say, Warren or people outside of the state, and see how that information matches up with information that's being put out in news articles and by the media. But because we only had news articles, I only had that lens to look through for this. Google Slides does not like me today. All right, and some personal and community influences. First, being a biology major and a Tri Beta member, I obviously want to see science succeed, and I looked at this at first from a scientific standpoint, especially as this is something that we're talking about a lot in all of my science-based classes. So I had a lot of information on COVID-19 from last semester and from this semester to look at from this angle. My public health minor was another lens that I was able to assess this problem from, especially in the sense of inequalities that COVID-19 is creating for communities. African American communities have a 2.6 and Latino communities have a 2.8 higher COVID-19 prevalence than white non-Hispanic communities. So this was a problem that I really kept at the forefront of this policy analysis, as these are the groups that aren't getting help that they need, and we're not kind of focusing towards these marginalized populations when we need to be. As a Roger Williams student and a Bristol, Rhode Island resident, I care about this community a lot. I want everyone to be safe and healthy here in this community. Roger had such a successful semester this year. We were one of the only colleges that made it up until basically the governor told us that we couldn't be in person anymore. So I'd love to see that translate to a larger level on Bristol. And I feel that through this lens, I was able to look at Roger's success and see how that could be translated to Bristol. And finally, as an honor student, just from freshman year on, we're very integrated into the Bristol, Rhode Island community. We do a ton of community service there. We're very integrated with the people in the community. So I think that fosters a sense of care about our community. And I was able to look outside of just being a college student here and being someone that wants to participate in the community, that's lived outside of the Roger Williams campus for the past 2 years, and kind of looking at it as a whole and not just the college campus. Just some perspective and diversity of thought for different disciplines that this is applicable to. Obviously public health for the reasons that I talked about before. For politics, we saw that the election, COVID-19 came up a lot, and in some cases, wearing a mask is kind of seen as a political statement, which is endangering people's health. So increasing education about mask compliance could help in this area. Education is another area where mask compliance is an issue. We need masks to go to school. We're all on Zoom right now, so mask compliance is something that needs to be looked at there. For economics, Rhode Island's currently in a 2-week pause for a lot of things, so the economy is hurting when mask compliance goes down, as it ends up in a result of a rise in COVID cases. Medicine and pharmaceuticals, we're currently watching the fastest made vaccine take place. And without mask compliance, this vaccine isn't going to be very effective if we're still spreading it without wearing masks. And finally, psychology, as we're coming up on these winter months where people aren't able to get outside as much, can't be with their families for holidays, people's mental health is going to take a toll from that. And I feel that mask compliance is something, if it increases, we'll be able to get people out of their houses sooner. Outside of the classroom, this affects Bristol residents as well as US residents. Our daily lives are changed every single day. No one wants to wear a mask all day, but in order for things to go back to normal, that needs to change. Healthcare workers, if you live in Rhode Island, you got the notification the other day that there's no more hospital beds here. They're all taken up because of COVID-19. So mask compliance there is an issue, as well as policy and lawmakers. They're working very hard right now, putting out different policies every single day about what's allowed, what's not allowed, where you have to wear your mask. So mask compliance there is also an issue. really doesn't like me. All right, so what's next? Some future studies that I'd like to look at is to look at populations outside of just Bristol, Rhode Island, look at larger populations, counties and states, and then take that information and compare it to other successful public health campaigns and kind of look at my 3 options and see if I can improve one option and make it a recommendation, or take my recommendation and improve it and make it better. And since masks will be a part of our lives for the near future, I would like to investigate ways outside of BHES and their funding and ways that I can increase mask compliance, whether it be in Bristol or on a larger scale. So finally, what can you do? First of all, always wear your mask in a public place to protect yourself and your community. Second, educate your friends and family members about mask wearing. Third, stay up to date with regulations regarding COVID-19, especially right now as everything's changing. And finally, trust science, because we are definitely all in this together. And here are my resources. And I'd like to thank the honors community for a great past 4 years, as well as Dr. Cottle for being my advisor through all of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was fantastic. Really great synthesis and integration of some of our goals, both scholarly, but also in terms of community engagement and the public sphere. So really well done. Before Dr. Turner has the chance to introduce our next speaker, Nick. So Nick, you should be getting ready. I just want to remind everybody something that I didn't say at the top, but I should have, which is that this is definitely a celebration. It's definitely a kind of formal moment for each of these students to present, but also celebrate the work that they've done. It's also a dialogue though, right? And so everyone who's here, we've got 69 people in this virtual room right now, which is fantastic. We did one of these, Dr. Palm will remember, we did one of these a year ago, and we had about 30 people in CAS 162. So we've more than doubled our crowd, which means that we actually have an opportunity to have a dialogue, a discussion, right? And so not right now, but I hope that some of your synapses are firing and some questions are being inspired based on Olivia's fantastic talk. And that after we hear from Nick and then from Zach, we will have an open period of Q&A. You can begin to put your questions or comments into the chat though now or at any time. And if you have to leave at the top of the hour, you could do that right now too. So just want to make that very clear. And with that, Dr. Turner.
Thank you, Olivia. That was wonderful. And yes, I see some questions going into the chat already. So I'm really excited for the dialogue that we'll have after we hear from our third presenter. But first, we want to introduce Nick Kathagelis, our international relations major with a minor in German, who asks us a really important question. Does the international community have the obligation to intervene in states who fail to protect their citizens? So Nick, I want to turn it over to you. And again, let's listen to see what you've been working on these last months.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Let me just share my screen real quick. So a little bit of trouble. Hold on 1 second. Can everyone see that? Yes.
Are you in the presentation? Because we're still on the editing screen.
Oh, let's see. Oh, hold on one.
Nick, if you put it in slideshow mode, Nick, if you go under slideshow and then.
Oh, I should be, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So this, my project was, does the international community have the obligation to intervene in states who fail to protect their citizens? So to introduce it, Hold on one. Hold on. Having a little bit of technical difficulties. 1 second. Oh. Shoot.
Nick, are you there? Can you hear us? It looks like you've frozen. Well,
I'll take that as a no.
yes, I think you're right about that. So let me see if I can stop his sharing for a second. Okay. So as Nick gets things sorted, we could move on to Zach, and then just once Nick is back online, have him take the third speaking role. Does that sound good to you, Zach?
Yeah, that works, Nick.
Okay, great. So Dr. Turner, you mind?
All right, sure.
Yeah.
So let me present to you Zach Santoro, from Criminal Justice. He's going to talk with us about policing crime and pandemics, how a global pandemic has affected the interpretations of crime. All right, so Zach, thanks for being able to jump in at just a moment's notice.
And everyone see my screen?
We can. It looks great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Turner and Dr. Campbell. Again, my name is Zachary Santoro. I'm a major in criminal justice with a core concentration in political science. I'm also in the master's program for criminal justice, so I will be here for the next year or so. So don't worry, I won't be leaving everybody just yet. So I did my project on policing crime and pandemics, how a global pandemic has affected the interpretations of crime. And so this project is loosely based off of a political science project that I did last spring. And I'll talk about that a little bit later towards the end, but just so that I'm using two different types of lenses when I'm looking into this. So to start off, the effects of COVID-19, everybody has been affected by COVID-19. It has affected all facets of life, from work to grocery shopping, to regulations on toilet paper, those types of things. Everyone has been affected by COVID-19. And so I'm really taking a deeper look into how COVID-19 pandemic has affected crime, and also, on the other hand, how it's affected the interpretations of crime and the presentation of crime in journalism. Has it affected crime? Has it affected the news? And so typically when we watch the news, we see, usually it's all about crimes. So-and-so there was an assault, there was a homicide, those types of things. And so now when we watch the news, is there a spotlight being shared with COVID and crime, or is it just COVID, or is it just crime? So trying to see different changes in the world today, in news presentation today because of COVID-19. Finally, looking at the public sphere, the research relates specifically to criminal justice, journalism, and political science, but doesn't end there. It affects all types of people. The news affects all people regardless of what group you're in, race, ethnicity, age. And so this kind of, the presentation of crime in popular media really affects all types of people. And so starting up at the top, and some facts and statistics, just trying to warm up a little bit. Right here you can see a graph. And so these are the homicides. So I'll be focusing on two specific cities, Providence, Rhode Island, as well as Boston, Massachusetts. So Boston, obviously a little bit larger city than Providence, but kind of making that comparison all the same. So I look specifically at the summer months of 2019 and 2020, so June, July, and August. and through my research, I found the calculation of homicides in both Boston and in Providence through their police department websites. And so as you can see, Providence stayed pretty consistent going through the pandemic, pre-pandemic, and during the pandemic. But Boston has this sharp spike during July of 2020, where there were 15 homicides. And so we're kind of looking at that specifically to see if journalism has the same type of spike, and they're focusing on that increasing crime. So really looking at journalism, if it reflects the trends of homicides, we can see that homicide, there is this big spike, everything else is pretty the same. And so seeing if journalism will do the exact same. Guiding questions, and so I'm really, as I said before, reflecting journalism, reflecting crime trends. If there's a spike in homicide, is there a spike in journalism? As well as how COVID-19 has affected crime reporting. Is there changes in motives? Is there a new COVID motive that COVID has caused some sort of crime? Is there a lot of uncertainty around crime, or is there just no attention given to crime at all because of this pandemic? As I said before, is crime sharing a spotlight, or has the spotlight been taken by this global pandemic? And finally, how do these effects relate to all people, everyday people? And so the reporting of crime really affects all people, because you'll see how crime is reported and interpret that as there's a lot of crime or there's a little crime. And so as shown in the last slide, there's that spike in homicides. If that's shown in journalism, we know that there's an increase in crime. But if there isn't, then we don't know what's going on. So to look at my analytical process, I specifically focused on homicides. So I have a background in criminal justice, and there is a big difference between homicide and murder. And so homicide is the killing of one person by another. This incorporates both legal and illegal killings, legal being self-defense and those types of crimes, and illegal, obviously, murder. And so I focus on homicide as a general topic, not differentiating between the two types of murder, or killings, excuse me. I focused on 3 primary news sources, print news sources, the Providence Journal for Providence, and so I took one newspaper source just for Providence as a little bit smaller city, and I took 2 news sources, the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, because Boston's a much larger city. It's about 5 times the size of Providence, and so using a couple more just to factor in the difference in size. I also used the Roger Williams University Library Archives to find these articles. And so that was a really good resource because it has all of the articles ready to go. I used the keyword of homicide to filter out the articles that I was looking for and use those for my data. Once I had all of the articles, I had a coding method, which was basically I was looking at the date of publication, looking at the months in which each article was published, the number of words in each article relating words to attention, and a suspected motive. So in most cases, the suspected motive was explicitly stated by the author of the article, and in some cases it wasn't, and so I'd use my background in criminal justice to kind of figure out what they were kind of going towards. And finally, looking at what am I looking for? I'm looking to compare news coverage in 2 different places and relating 2 different places and how they cover the news. Changes in coverage could have been due to COVID, if there were any changes whatsoever, could have been to a lack of resources or a change in resources. And if there is a change in coverage, who is to blame? Is it journalists, the news sources? Does it have to do with law enforcement or the pandemic in general? And so to start off my research, I know this graph is a little crazy, so I'll work through it a little bit. And so we're looking at homicides versus news stories. And so again, as you saw in the previous graph, the blue is still the homicides. And in the yellow and orange, you can see the number of news stories posted by the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. And so pretty much during 2019, both the Globe and the Herald did a pretty relatively decent job at covering crime and homicides in the city of Boston. though once we hit that July of 2020, the big spike of homicide in Boston, neither publication did a very good job, did an adequate job at covering the homicides that were happening in the city. The Providence Journal is seen in gray, and so that trend line stays consistent and is pretty much almost always above or at the same as the homicide rate in Providence. So the Providence Journal does a very adequate job, a very good job at covering crime in that area, in the Providence area, and sometimes going above and beyond, but we'll look at that a little bit. So here we're looking at the Providence Journal, specifically focusing on Providence. So again, we have that Providence homicide number and the Providence Journal original stories. And so original stories, we're looking at the first time that a story is being published. So this is not including follow-up stories or updates on that. And so the numbers will change a little bit for Providence Journal as they publish multiple follow-up stories for some of the articles. But again, the trend is still the same. They are in all cases either posting the same number of stories, so accounting for all homicides in the Providence area, or going above and beyond and posting some articles, publishing some articles about some homicides that are happening outside of the Providence area. And so you can see specifically in July 2019, June in 2020, and August in 2020, they're posting an extra story about some sort of homicide that's happening outside of that Providence or Rhode Island area. Coming back into Boston, obviously a much larger city, looking at those original stories from the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, really underwhelming in most cases. Only in August of 2019 were they all the same, and in most cases are very underwhelming and not really covering a lot of the homicides that are happening in the city. And it's a very interesting trend to look at. They don't keep up, both news sources don't keep up with the spike in crime. And that leads us to the question of why. So what are they focusing on? Are they diverting the audience's attention? Are we focusing on something else? Obviously, COVID could have some sort of effect on that, but we need to research a little bit more to figure that one out. And finally, looking at motives. And so, as I said before, a lot of the motives were directly and explicitly stated in each news story or subsequent follow-up stories. And so for each story was given a specific motive, as you can see here. And so I categorized those into a variety of categories. My hypothesis going into this research was that there would be a lot more uncertainty, There would be a lot more uncertainty with motive, an unsure motive coming into the 2020 pandemic, that we would be unsure about why something happened, or there would be a complete new category of COVID-19 related murders. So people going crazy in the house because we're being in quarantine, or things like that. I also hypothesized that domestic violence would increase as a result of quarantines in homes, but that obviously is not the case. One reason why I think there is a little bit more uncertainty here in the 2020 column is that there aren't a lot of follow-up stories published by most of the news outlets, published by news outlets. And so a lot of them didn't have enough information or didn't follow up on the original information. And so that kind of leaves us with some uncertainty. There's no closure there. We don't really know what's going on. And so kind of to conclude all of my research, we're looking at COVID-19's effect on journalism. 2019, there was very adequate coverage, journalism coverage on homicides in both Boston and in Providence. But when 2020 hit and the COVID pandemic, there's terrible coverage in Boston. Providence is still very well covered, but there are too many homicides for the news outlets to keep up with, as well as the election is ranking up and there's a global pandemic as well. So these news outlets seem to focus more on different topics than homicides in general. There seems to be differing motives, although inconsistent. The pandemic, I thought, was to blame for some sort of increase, though that's not explained through a lot of the news articles. A lot of the homicides did go unreported, and so homicides weren't reported completely through, at least in Boston. And so it's very interesting to look at the rise in uncertainty as well, that there's not a lot of follow-up stories. And so journalists really had enough time to put in an original story, but that was it, and had to move on to another story and didn't have time to follow up, which is a very interesting trend to see. And finally, inconsistent coverage. Again, Providence was very well covered, Boston was not, and so that creates inconsistency with both groups, with both areas and both communities of people. There is a misdirecting to the audience in Boston where the audience believes that there is a consistent crime rate, that everything is consistent where there is a spike. And so that's very dangerous when we're looking at that from a law enforcement perspective, because if people do not know what is going on, then they cannot protect themselves and react in the proper way. And so this kind of brings up a little issue with law enforcement using journalism in that facet. As I said before, it could have been COVID related. It could be a lack of resources, but it also could be a lack of communication. As I just mentioned, law enforcement uses journalism and news outlets to kind of relate stories and get more information. A lot of crimes are solved through the use of journalism and getting word out, getting photos out of suspects and those types of things. And law enforcement uses a lot of journalism to help solve cases and get people involved. If there's no journalism, there's not a lot of solving cases. And so there might be a lack of communication between law enforcement and journalists. Looking at some of the limitations of my study, I did use the Roger Williams Library archives for most of my research. And I did double check for accuracy using a couple different websites, but some stories might have sneaked through the cracks. And so I just wanted to put that up as a limitation, that there might be some stories that are not consistent in the Roger Williams Library archives, although I'm pretty sure they are pretty good, but just my keywords, I did use the keyword of homicide, though I do have a criminal justice background and I do understand the difference between homicide and murder, but I cannot hold journalists to the same standard. So some articles might have been misworded and misrepresented and using words of murder or other things. And so those might have slipped through the cracks as well when I was looking for my data. And finally, the motives, as I said before, most were explicitly stated in the articles, although some were not. And so I had to infer based on some of the information there. And so those might have been a little different as well. Finally, looking at the public sphere, the most important part of this project, looking at information available. News is a way of making information readily available to all people. And so the news outlets have the job of presenting important information to people so that they are educated and know what is going on in their community, in the world today. And if that is not directly related to what the trends that are going on, it makes a misinformed population and it makes an ignorant population about what is going on. And excuse me. And all people need to know what is going on. Again, as I've been mentioning, in Boston, there was that spike in July, and it was not reported completely by the news media. And so that leads to some misinformation in the community itself. As I've been saying the entire time, this affects all people. All people are subjects to the news and do research on things that they're interested in. And it's not just certain groups, it's not just criminal justice or political science, it's all people. And all people need to be educated on the things that go on in their communities, in their towns, and in their cities. And so the way of doing that is going through news media outlets like the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, and the Providence Journal. Differences in coverage, like in Providence versus Boston, creates differences in groups of people. And so some people in Providence know exactly what's going on, whereas some people in Boston do not. And that's a little dangerous when we're going into that. Looking at political science versus criminal justice, two of my major backgrounds. As I said before, this project began as a political science project, We were looking at how the news can attract attention to specific stories as it relates to the President of the United States. If the President is giving attention to a story, which has more power. And so I took that idea of news attention and I wanted to bring it more towards criminal justice, which is my major background. And so it kind of gave an interesting light about how people feel about different things because of crime related, because of how the news reports on it. And finally, what can you do? Very easy, and everyone has been telling everybody for the longest time, research, research, research. Confirming your information that you are getting through known sources, through registered sources, confirming information through many sources, multiple sources, making sure that that information is factual is some of the most important stuff. Reliable news is good news, and that helps make an informed and an educated population. Fake news, I know it's seen as a joke in many facets of life, but fake news is everywhere. And it's interesting to kind of look into how news is being misguided through this project, at least through homicides and being misguided and misrepresented in different areas. Finally, I know this was a lot of research. This was in-depth research that I did, and it took a long time. But light research about topics that bother you, interest you, or things that you know little about take no time at all. It's very simple, and it's actually an interesting process. This project was very interesting to me, and it did take a long time, but it was a very interesting time. And so really challenging your ignorance and pursuing your ignorance, I know is very key in the honors program, and working on pursuing your ignorance is very important in making us as a culture, as a community, and as a nation more overwhelmingly educated and less ignorant. So finally, a big thank you to the honors program. I know it's cliche, but I would not be here today if I was not in the honors program. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Turnell have helped me a lot through this process specifically, as well as my last 3.5 years in the honors program. Thank you to Dr. Verano. This was an independent study that I did with Dr. Verano. He was very helpful throughout the process. The Roger Williams Justice Studies Department helped me out a lot, as well as my good friend Michael Cerullo, who's graduating from the class of 2020 at Emerson. He's a journalism major, and he helped me with all of my coding stuff through journalism. So thank you very much.
Awesome, Zach. Thank you so much for that. Very timely, very topical deep dive into how criminal justice and political science, but also media studies, journalism, pushing yourself to a place. This is really a good honors attribute too, right? You've got this great background in criminal justice. You've done a lot of coursework. You haven't done coursework in journalism, but you were called to really do a fantastic job. So thank you. I've got a lot of questions. Thank you also for reminding us of the old Russian proverb, trust but verify, right? So yeah, read what's out there and talk to your friends, but then do the research, and you can see maybe what you haven't been able to see previously, right? So trust but verify. Thanks a lot, Zach. Dr. Turner.
Yes, thank you, Zach. That was so interesting. And as Dr. Campbell said, so timely. I think Nick is back with us in our virtual world here. So I'm ready to introduce our final presenter of the evening. Nick, you ready?
I'm all set now. Sorry about that. I'm not
excellent.
Tech savvy person, but.
Well, it's a strange world we're in here, doing everything virtually. So you're doing great. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Everyone can see it, right? So my name is Nick Cafagelis, and for my honors capstone, I was addressing the question, does the international community have the obligation to intervene in states who fail to protect their citizens? For my project, I chose my senior thesis, which I wrote as a junior. My goal was to figure out why the countries of the world, which I will refer to as states, fail to protect human rights, and how attempts at protecting human rights usually have alternative motives. I decided to analyze the document called Responsibility to Protect, which is known as R2P, which was adopted by the United Nations to address human rights. around human rights violations around the world, preferably before they happened. My project attempted to tackle broader themes of collectivism, which is the idea of these states working together in a global community, and also realism, which is the current theory that drives foreign policy today, which is the idea that states are motivated by self-interest. So R2P is made of 3 pillars
Nick,
that address different stages of humanitarian
Nick,
crisis.
sorry, Nick. Can you hear me? This is Dr. Kim. I'm so
Yep.
sorry that I have to interrupt, but we can't see the slides as you progress through them. We can see
Oh.
the sort of easel, the editing mode of PowerPoint,
Yeah.
and it's stuck on your first slide. So I'm wondering if you could see if in the settings perhaps you can mirror your slideshow. It seems I have no doubt that you can see it, but we can't see it. There we go. Now we see slide
Okay.
1.
Yep.
And can you take us to the next one?
Yep.
There we go. So you've finished this one in the introduction, and I assume that you're going to go on to the next one now, and now we can see it all. Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'll start from right here. So R2P is made of 3 pillars that address different stages of humanitarian crises. These are the backbone of the document, or the responsibility to rebuild, known as Pillar 3, is the most controversial because it loosely defines the use of military intervention. My findings suggested that states are much more likely to enact Pillar 3 than the other 2 pillars, because Pillar 3 can be used to pursue national interests in the form of military intervention using the disguise of humanitarian relief. So, for example, the U.S. might intervene militarily in Libya on the side of the quote-unquote pro-democratic forces under the disguise of Pillar 3, not because it cares for the well-being of the Libyan people, but because it desires a government friendly and supporter of the U.S. and its allies. That is an example of what the dominant theory is, which is realism, in which national interest drives international politics. So I broke up my project into 5 subheadings, each analyzing an aspect of R2P. The first subheading, the possible abuse of R2P, is where I discuss that countries are not driven to try and stop human rights violations. The second is ignoring the collective power principle, is where I argue that the U.S. and its allies, known as the West, are not willing to work with countries like Russia or China because they do not align with U.S. interests or principles. The third is the acceptance of R2P concept but not implementation, which is where I found the states overall agree that R2P is a great idea, but there's no universal agreeable way to implement it. The fourth is military action based on R2P, and the effect, which I analyzed, and concept, is where I analyzed how states intervene using R2P, and that how other states are affected through the use of intervention. And lastly, I looked at number 5. I looked at a counter document called the Responsibility While Protecting, which was introduced by Brazil, that criticized R2P for being too intervention heavy. So one of the cases I looked at was Somalia. Somalia is a case where R2P applies in the modern world. R2P was introduced in 2005, and since this declaration, the nations of the world have failed to call for intervention or any kind of help in Somalia. Somalia, just some context, Somalia has been in a state of civil war for the past 20 or so years. According to the CIA, famine, sex trafficking, terrorism, piracy, and war crimes have existed and will continue to exist into the foreseeable future. I argue that Somalia has little economic, geopolitical, and political value to the world, and is why the world is not involved in fixing Somalia, as R2P would suggest. This is mainly because the U.S. and its allies have little interest, or there's nothing to gain from helping Somalia become stable. So my conclusion to R2P is that I conclude that R2P fails to be effective for 4 reasons. One is because states do not want to work collectively together. 2 is that we are in a unipolar power system, meaning that the U.S. is the sole superpower and does not have to share authority with anyone, and also is never put in check. 3 is that realism is the dominant theory, meaning that states pursue their national interests over moral concerns. And number 4 is that there's too much emphasis on Pillar 3 instead of working on Pillars 1 and 2 to prevent humanitarian crises from happening. Countries would just rather intervene for a couple months and then leave. So my connections to the public sphere. For civic communication, it's the start of getting everyone on the same page when it comes to understanding and moving forward with the topic. In the case of foreign policy and humanitarianism, the best way to understand international politics is to understand historical examples and to analyze the reasons for how policy decisions were made. The process could be introduced through grade school into high school to students to have a better understanding in how their country does business in the international arena. I understand that not everyone has time, especially now, to open a history book and just read a bunch of historical examples of international policy. But there are other ways of viewing how international policy works. So on social media, in the last several months, I have noticed that there are many forms of information and explanations are done through fast and bulleted lists, so that the viewers doesn't lose interest and is not overwhelmed. International relations is a very complex field, but by providing the basics in an easy listed manner in a well-known social media app could lead to a better understanding of how our country does business, and it could lead to more educated discussions. As you see in the example on the right, this is just an example of mental illness and like why it makes people tired. And then the example to the right of it is just a bulleted list of different ways, and so it produces a more understanding of the topic and not just a blatant blatant ignorance. So for my civic analysis of knowledge, so some of you may ask yourselves, how does this relate to my field of study? So I analyzed, there were three topics or three fields. A huge reason why countries have humanitarian crises is because they lack health, judicial, and educational systems. There are millions of people suffering in the world that need health and medical experts, so that do not blame their neighbors for diseases or lack of water or food. Developing countries need help from lawyers and lawmakers to establish sound judicial systems and protect the rights of the people and punish those accordingly. Lastly, the developing world needs teachers and other academia to guide students towards democratic principles and away from violence. It's up to these fields to study to help instruct and develop the developing world to stabilize their countries and to prevent atrocities from happening. Also, we must, as a society, must begin discussion about how realism is truly a selfish mindset, because the emphasis on what one can gain from helping instead of and also it's also based on fear of annihilation. If we at a local level can start to learn to give and expect our neighbors to also give, then we can begin a cultural movement that may end up guiding U.S. foreign policy someday. This means that we must begin to trust one another, and that we can and no longer fear for our own safety. Some small exchanges in civic life can change how we view the acting world or acting in the world, instead of wondering what our neighbors are instead of wondering what our neighbors are going to give to us, we can actually wonder if they are okay and as well as we are, and then we can truly become a humanitarian nation. So there's also plenty of diversity of thought when it comes to R2P, and I examined a lot of it. One of the goals was to understand how different countries viewed R2P. What I found was a divide between two groups, which are the geopolitical East and the geopolitical East, which is mainly Russia and China, and then the geopolitical West, which is the US and its allies. Eastern societies call for a more collective action to stop humanitarian crises, while Western countries prefer to work alone unless their national interests convince them otherwise. So also Eastern states, like dominantly Russia and China, were very against interventionism, which in comparison to Western states, which they loved interventionism because it was very easy and very aligned very easily with their national interests. It was an interesting divide because countries like Russia and China have a history of being invaded by Western countries, and they're also very against the idea of intervening as a policy option. I was also able to examine the voices of the developing world, which mainly consists of countries from Africa and Central and South America. These countries were also not totally against the idea of intervention, but they would like a greater say on whether or not a country could intervene in their affairs or not. They acknowledge that countries do not have the power to quell the violence in their states, and could benefit from a stronger military intervention. Overall, there are many views of the table that are represented in my thesis, and all countries seem to agree that human rights violations must end, but there's little agreement on how they should end them. So, challenging contexts and cultures, my viewpoints were incredibly challenged throughout this project. I knew humanitarianism was not at the forefront of American or almost any country's foreign policy, and I thought that I wasn't going to find this research interesting and rewarding. I was a pure realist, meaning I believe that altruistic humanitarianism is not the national interest of the United States. A critique I have on myself is I entered the project with a preset mindset on what my conclusions would be, and that may have influenced how I researched. So I might have looked up just U.S. foreign policy in the beginning, but then I slowly progressed myself to expand my viewpoints. Um, it was very easy for me to like acknowledge that states act in their own self-interest. It just made sense. My own work ended up challenging my prior viewpoints, but I did not realize that humanitarianism was actually a golden opportunity for the United States to spread its influence and help other countries suffer around the world at the same time. I found a way to include humanitarianism in my prior mindset and make realism and humanitarianism work together. So we are currently moving into a new age where international institutions are becoming the battleground for influence and control. The U.S. needs to maintain a global presence and be at the top supporter of organizations like the World Health Organization and the International Monetary Fund. By doing this, we can exert American values across the world of tolerance and respect for human life. As an honors student, you must also look at how different countries protect the rights of the citizens and what is the best path for the developing world. And then ask yourself, do you want a pro-democratic country leading the charge of human rights, or do you want a country that has numerous human rights violations at the forefront? I have followed the news of countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. China is known for using forced labor and also re-education camps of the Uyghur population. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his constituents have also poisoned their opposition leaders. So there is no democracy there. And also in Saudi Arabia, as some of you may heard that Jamal Khashoggi was poisoned in a Saudi embassy in Turkey for speaking out against the royal family. I believe the U.S. is one of the few countries and places in the world where it places the rights of the the individual above all else. I also believe that as a principle, we should be. Well, I believe that our principles that we take for granted should be shared with all mankind. So instead of neglecting humanitarian missions, I now believe the U.S. should embrace them. So for my professional identity and commitment, growing up, I thoroughly enjoyed reading history books and watching the news. I remember watching the U.S. military attack Baghdad on cable news, and even though I knew nothing of the conflict at 4 years old, I never really analyzed or sought the root causes of why things were happening around the world or what happened in history books other than what was told or depicted to me. I entered RWU as a declared international relations major in the honors program. And one of the biggest things I remember that had the biggest impact was I remember going into Bristol with Dr. Spritz during the city as tax assignment, which forced me to actually ask hard questions and not take anything at face value. As many of you may know, that Bristol has a dark slave trading past, but many Rhode Islanders and non-Rhode Islanders don't even know that, and they take Bristol as this quaint little fishing town. This really pushed me to begin to realize the U.S. is not the only one with ideas worth hearing out, and that we ourselves are guilty of neglecting our own hypocrisy when it comes to humanitarianism. So we live in a very complex world, and we must work to make it better. And the first step is understanding the root causes of humanitarianism. We are facing a crisis in the world where humans are suffering every day, and we have that don't have access to medicine, water, food, and safe places to live. The world needs leadership, and I'm eager to be a part of that process that makes the world more humanitarian. While participating in political clubs and in events on campus, I remember hearing the America First as a rallying call for many Americans who feel like that we should be focusing more on inward than instead of outward, because there are many problems here at home and that we don't have the time to focus on our outward ambitions. And so I am committed. So I decided to take that, and I decided to think about that I am actually committed to pursuing an American principles first policy, which means that we should share our great fortune with society with the rest of the world, but also acknowledge that we need to work here at home to be competitive and reliable in the modern age. Before we can become a great humanitarian nation, we must value life over anything else. That means updating our healthcare system, fixing our infrastructure, holding authorities accountable, providing jobs for Americans in the green sector from the fossil fuel sector, and proving to minority communities that they are an essential part of the American dream. Only then can we pursue a broader global American dream. We must also practice as we preach. We must protect diversity, encourage tolerance, protect civil rights, lecture equality in law, encourage self-preservation, and call out those who oppress and harm as call out and oppress those who harm those who harm those who they are supposed to protect. This would be a great way for America to spread its virtue around the world and generate the American favorability over our adversaries. I plan to work in government and the military in the coming future. I intend to take my critical mindset with me. The honors program and my IR classes taught me to take 2 steps back whenever addressing a problem. Complicated problems require delicate approaches, and to approach complicated problems, one must first understand the entirety of the situation. That being said, I truly thank my professors in the honors, IR, and poli-sci departments. I wouldn't be here without them, and I thank you for challenging me to think and not being afraid that not every question has answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Great provocation there to always take our critical mindsets forward and keep an open mindset, as you did. It sounds like at the beginning of this project, thinking, you know, I'm a hard-boiled realist, and you emerge with a more complicated, but also more interesting and maybe more viable view on things and a path forward. So thank you for that. Now we have some, let me see. Nick, do you mind stopping the share so that we can all see each other? Thank you. Yeah. So now I think we should just go right into it, right? We've got about 20 minutes left. We've heard from Olivia Franco, we've heard from Zach Santoro, just most recently from Nicholas Kafgelis. We've got a few questions in the chat, but I wonder if anyone who is here who would just love to you know, unmute themselves, share your video too, so that we all can see it, and just put a question to one or multiple of our panelists here. Thank you.
I have a question, but I don't want to steal the floor from students.
Please, Dr. Palm, get us started.
So for Olivia and Zach in particular, because I think Nick got into this a little bit more, how did performing your project, especially during COVID, influence what you want to do with your life? You both talked about what we can do with regard to your problems. I thought that was great. How did this shape you? You know, Olivia, for your project in particular, the pandemic, I mean, it touches on biology, it touches on public health. There's so many ways that you can contribute. And Zach too, you know, kind of criminal justice within this pandemic world. Just talk a little bit about how doing your project, and especially doing it this year in this context, has shaped you and your goals.
Yeah, for me, I really want to pursue a future in pharmaceuticals. So getting to watch this vaccine, the process of it, of how all these different companies are making such great strides in pharmaceutical history, that's been like super inspiring for me to watch, and just kind of pushed me to want to do this in the future. And also the kind of idea that the community that this pandemic has brought in, especially for pharmaceuticals, that all these companies are working together all towards the same solution.
Yeah, so doing my career aspirations are more into the federal government of law enforcement, and so I'm looking more into like FBI, CIA, those types of things. And really, when I was doing this project and seeing the amount of influence that journalism has on my field and how people reflect my field and how people think about the field of criminal justice is very interesting. And I think one of my most important conclusions when I was finishing up my project was the fact that journalism and criminal justice has to work together. And that's how you really get, I believe I mentioned it briefly in my presentation, but people in law enforcement officials really need to work with journalism and journalists to get out messages about crimes or about other things. And so it's really important for all people to understand what's going on criminal-wise, crime-wise in a city and in an area. And so it's very interesting, the relationship between journalism and criminal justice.
And we've certainly seen this year tensions between journalism and the federal government and authorities in a lot of ways, right?
Yes. And also to respond to Marissa's question, Marissa just put a question in the chat. Zach, do you think that part of the reason that there were homicides were so much larger in Boston during the summer had anything to do with the large amount of protests that were occurring? I honestly am not sure, but I do not believe that there was that many deaths in response to the peaceful protests. I don't believe there were that many people who died because of the protests. But I do think that the protests did have an effect on journalism, and that journalism was focusing more on the protests happening in Boston and around the Boston area, and then taking some of that focus away from homicides as well.
Thanks, Zach. Speaking of the chat, we have one from the top of the hour, which was put to Olivia. It's from Isabella Gentile, and she asks, basically, in terms of the mass mailing campaign, do you see it being beneficial to repeat such a campaign effort over time, since we're not yet out of the woods, right, when it comes to this pandemic? And in terms of future studies, would you be interested in, how would you, or things that you would be interested in, how would you build on this policy analysis and looking at specifically ensuring that information gets to members of marginalized communities?
I think for that first part of the question, I would like to reassess to see if we ever went into a third wave, if that was a possibility, because since we are coming up in a heightened number of cases and number of deaths, that's really pressing the issue here for people to start really complying to mask wearing rules. I think that if there was another instance of a third wave where the mask compliance isn't going up, then that was definitely something that I would want to do to reinforce this message. In terms of marginalized communities, I would definitely like to work with BHEAS a lot more closely than I was able to this semester, as they have access to a lot more of that information than I do. And they've had experience in Bristol. They've been here, I think, the past 7 years, I believe. So they have a lot of experience with these marginalized communities, and they have a lot more information than I could find from like town websites or any type of news article. So specifically, I'd like to work with them in the future and seeing how I could tailor my other two options to make them more accessible for marginalized communities, or to even tailor a certain program for them in particular.
Great. Yeah, BHEAS is a wonderful wealth of resources. And I imagine in addition to thinking specifically about messaging that might work for marginalized communities, you have to think about language. You have to think about opportunities for bridging those possible divides that might be within the Bristol community. Thank you so much, Olivia. Oliver Sherry has just put a question in the chat for Nick. So I'll give voice to that as well. And then keep thinking, because we have plenty of time to keep discussing. But Nick, great presentation, Oliver writes, and he completely agrees. I'm just wondering, do you think that considering America's foreign policy of only helping other countries when it sees it as beneficial to themselves, do you think you might be at odds with the system in the Navy as you look forward? You haven't lived your life yet, but as you speculate, is there a tension there, or do you see things more clearly?
Well, great question, honestly. So what I'm thinking about using the Navy for is definitely for experience and to get myself into a more bureaucratic position in the government. But one thing I need to do is to gain experience, and I can do that by going overseas. And the Navy is a great way to do that. From what my research, I plan to go through that in their intelligence field, so I can learn more about the countries that I will be dealing with. However, when it comes to America's foreign policy, that truly has to start from the bottom and move towards the top. So us as a country, we have to learn that helping one another is much more, and wondering how our neighbors are doing is much more important than our own, fear for our own safety. And if we can change that at the local level, and then and that will eventually maintain inside the mindset of people that move their way up into government, and then they will be the guiding factors of America's foreign policy. So I'm using the Navy as an experience builder, but it really is up to all of us to change that mindset that our neighbors are not out to get us, that we as a global community can really come together and really stop and really share American values worldwide.
Thank you, Nick. Other questions for our panelists?
Yes. Good evening. Hi, Nick. I'm also Nick.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I was just curious. In correlation to your presentation about humanitarianism, did you look at the Ebola outbreak that went during Obama's presidency and compare that to how Trump treated the coronavirus pandemic?
I did not. Um, but there are different ways of going about handling a pandemic. What I'm arguing as of now, is that the idea with humanitarianism is that if we, as the United States, help countries around the world um, build themselves and help prevent these diseases from occurring and send our doctors over there instead of our adversaries' doctors, then these countries will look favorably upon the U.S. And instead of using intervention as a forceful policy, um, we can actually build soft power, which is the idea that countries just like us because of who we are, not because we're forcing ourselves militarily upon them. Those are two different approaches to a pandemic. I would say the Ebola outbreak was not as dangerous as what the coronavirus is now. Again, two different politicians, two different takes on how government should handle crises.
Thank you.
I have a question for Zach. Hopefully this is a relatively narrow one, but boy, when you start to put politics and reporting and COVID in the same bucket, boy, it gets complicated really quickly. But I'm
Yes.
wondering if you could, so you seem to be kind of offering that COVID has had an impact, right? And that COVID has had an impact, possibly, you don't say it because you're polite, but I think you're saying that, the folks up there in Boston in the editorial rooms are saying, hey, COVID is what's selling your papers right now. Let's not report on the homicides, right? It's COVID and the election, right? And so it's the editorial, is that, like, let's talk a little bit more about that and how we would confirm that, because I'm sure you didn't do interviews with editors. That's one part, but you also seem to be developing what I think is an interesting thesis, that the way that crime reporting happens is affected by the pandemic because there aren't follow-ups, right? There might be an initial, there's a body bag in the street, sorry, right? Just to speak in purple prose, but then because a journalist can't follow up with the sergeant on the beat or with the detective, the trail goes cold and there's no follow-up reporting, and that then impacts what the public knows. Both of those are probably true, but I wonder if you could respond to both of those kind of boiled down like that.
No, it is a very good point. What sells papers is usually what goes in the papers. And so you make a very good point that because, especially if I look back at that July of 2020, where there's a massive increase, a massive spike in homicides in the Boston area, there's also, I believe Marissa mentioned it before, there's also the Black Lives Matter protests going on in Boston. There's also the election going on. There's also the COVID pandemic. There's lots of things going on. And at this moment, homicides, you make a good point, are not going to sell. And really, especially with the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, who have filed for bankruptcy, in the past, what sells is what will be in the paper. And so that's a very good point. And if I did have more resources, I would look into that and interview editorial and those offices, because that's a very good point and a very interesting point. If you could remind me of the second part of the question, though.
Sure. Well, I think this is your idea. It would never occurred to me, but that there's something specific in reporting about crime,
Yes.
in how a crime reporter does their work, that COVID and the fact that we're all in
Yes.
Zoom boxes all day impacts, right?
Yes. No, that is a very good. It's an interesting, that I was kind of alluding to as well. A lot of crime reporting isn't just that first original story, it's the follow-up subsequent stories. And so usually you'll get that first story at the scene of the crime. A journalist will show up, interview the sergeant, interview the detective, kind of figure out what's going on, and then write up that article and publish it. And that's usually what you'll get. In the subsequent weeks to months after the fact, they'll follow up and ask more questions about that. As we've seen lately, and probably because of the pandemic, journalists don't have the resources, and really because we can't really be in person all too many times, aren't at that original at the scene of the crime when we first happened, right? And so because they're not there, they're interviewing sergeants over Zoom, they're interviewing detectives over Zoom who get a little bit of information, don't really want to talk much, and then we write up an article and that's too much work, so we're just going to go on to the next thing. And so it's a lot of factors going on, but usually what happens in a typical year, air quotes, without a global pandemic would be follow-up stories and really updating on those and publishing those in newspapers and online and websites and such. But we're not really seeing that trend anymore because of the pandemic, because of a lack of resources, and because we're not allowed to be in person as much.
Thank you, Zach. Some wonderful veins for further research too, if you had more time and resources, and you will be around, right? So
I will be around, so I can continue. I can continue. Be here next year.
We have time for a few more questions. If anyone has anything in mind.
I have a question for all three of our presenters. So I'm looking at who's here in the meeting with us tonight, and I see a lot of honor students, some who will be preparing their capstones really soon, others who've got a little bit of time. So as you look back at your time in the honors program, what experience would you think was really helpful as you kind of went on this journey through the capstone? Maybe something in an honors classroom, something outside in the LLC, or just spending time with other honor students. I'm just wondering if each of you could maybe think about that for a minute and offer some thoughts that might help some of our up and coming honor students.
If I could start at the beginning, I have a very quick answer, and it's that Pursuing Ignorance article. That is the honors summer assignment that has stayed in the honors summer assignment for as long as I've been an honors ambassador. And I have reviewed that specific article or that TED Talk, I cannot remember which, every summer, and have reviewed it and gone over it. And it's a very interesting point. And I mentioned in my research, in my presentation as well, pursuing ignorance is very interesting. And ignorance is kind of seen as an insult in most cases. Oh, you're being ignorant, you're not thinking. But all people are ignorant. And this project, this presentation, every time I got to a little standstill, wasn't really sure where else I should go with my research. I said, you know what, this is interesting. Let's go down here. I don't know a lot about this. And that pursuing of ignorance really helped me drive through, and really is one of the key factors in the honors program in general, is pursuing that ignorance that we're from the get-go, the summer of your freshman year going in. And that's really what kept me going the rest of my 3.5 years.
All right, thanks. Olivia, Nick, any thoughts?
Yeah, for me, it was actually, I believe it was your class in 103. We talked a lot about food deserts. And then I took community engagement last year when the pandemic hit and we had to transfer online. And we also did a lot about food deserts. And I think that the honors program, just from a science standpoint, there's not a lot of discussion about disparities, and especially in Bristol, because I feel like a lot of people just think that Bristol's, like the 4th of July town, it's great here. But we do have a lot of disparities and issues within this county and within this town. And I think that the honors program brings light to that. And sometimes I believe that is a little bit of a flaw of the science community, is we don't get to talk about that as much as we should. So I think that definitely turned into my part of my project, as well as with public health, because that is something that we're able to talk about in that major outside of biology.
Thanks.
For me, it was, the biggest things that helped me with my capstone was definitely taking Dr. Palm's honors 400 class. We broke down each each of the pillars of the public sphere. We took our time to write them out, and Dr. Palm would comment on them, and we could meet with him whenever we wanted. I really thought that was helpful because I technically I had this project done last semester because I took the class and I was trying to figure out how I was going to graduate early. But really going through that, I was able to really refine my essay and also refine my project. But also the honors professors, I gotta give you guys credit because you guys like are always available. Like you always respond within within hours, and like never have a problem with that. And it's really beneficial for a college student because I have had some professors that they don't respond for for a couple weeks and then the problem's already gone. So just appreciation. So for reference for young honor students is definitely ask questions when you need to because like your honors professors will respond. They're there to get you through it. So
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Olivia. I think that's actually a fitting place to end. So thank you, Dr. Turner, for that wonderful and inspiring question that got such great responses too. All of this was fantastic. I think if you're up for unmuting and giving our panelists a round of applause, they've certainly earned it. So, or virtual round of applause. Good job, guys. You're not quite finished yet, right? You haven't officially graduated. We still have another, week or so of classes, exams, all the rest of it. And Dr. Turner and I will be following up about your presentations and your capstone essays as well. But for now, thank you all for showing up, and have a wonderful day. And for everyone who is not an honors graduate, and the three of you also are welcome to come back in the spring if you'd like for SASH Part 2, which will be much larger. I think we'll have about 40 presentations in the spring, in the third week of April. So that we'll be able to get back together and do it all again in due time. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe out there, and good luck on exams.
Thank you. Great job, guys. Great job to each of you. Have a great day. Have a great day and weekend.
Very much, you too.
And great night and weekend, I should say. Days already 3/4 over.